Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most misunderstood chapters of medieval life, the chaotic, hilarious, and surprisingly familiar world of medieval teenagers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in a medieval village at about 14 years old. Yesterday, everyone still called you just a child whenever you did something foolish. Today, your father is wondering why you haven't already chopped enough firewood to survive the winter. Your mother has a list of chores long enough to qualify as a religious pilgrimage, and your neighbors have started asking when to become a useful member of society. Good morning. Childhood has officially been cancelled. The funny thing is that the Middle Ages didn't really have the idea of a teenager. There wasn't a magical period where adults accepted that you were still figuring yourself out. There was no, don't worry, they're only 14. Instead, it was more like, you're 14. Here's an act. Try not to lose a foot. Needless to say, this system produced interesting results. Depending on where you were born, you might already be leaving home to become an apprentice. One day, you're sleeping in your parents' cottage. The next, you're living with a blacksmith, baker, carpenter, or tailor who has promised to teach you a valuable trade. He has also promised to shout at you whenever you make a mistake, which fortunately for him you'll do several times before breakfast. If you stayed on the family farm, things weren't much gentler. Your alarm clock was a rooster with anger issues. Your daily schedule included feeding animals much larger than yourself, hauling buckets heavy enough to make modern gym membership seem unnecessary, and working from sunrise until sunset. Somewhere in between, you were expected to develop excellent character. Apparently, exhaustion was considered an educational tool. If you were born into a noble family, don't get too comfortable. Instead of mucking out pigsty, you were expected to master riding, hunting, swordsmanship, etiquette, and enough table manners to avoid embarrassing your family in front of other nobles. You still had adults criticizing everything you did. They simply did it while wearing nicer clothes. Girls faced the same sudden leap into responsibility. You learned spinning, weaving, cooking, brewing, gardening, caring for younger siblings, and managing a household before you'd even finished growing. Noble girls studied music, embroidery, reading, household management, and courtly manners. In either case, everyone seemed convinced that adulthood could be learned by assigning you more work. History suggests otherwise, because despite the endless responsibilities, you were still inconveniently a teenager. Your brain wasn't thinking, I should spend this beautiful spring afternoon improving my economic productivity. It was thinking, I wonder if my friends are doing something incredibly stupid without me, and they probably were. This is where medieval records become unexpectedly entertaining. Town officials complain constantly about groups of young people making too much noise after dark. Priests grumbled that they giggled during sermons. Guild masters accused apprentices of disappearing when there was work to do, only to mysteriously reappear when dinner was served. Parents wondered why perfectly intelligent children suddenly lost the ability to make sensible decisions whenever three friends were standing nearby. Some mysteries truly are timeless. Older generations also complained that young people cared too much about fashion, spent too much time flirting, stayed out too late, talked back, ignored advice, and believed they knew everything despite having accomplished very little. If that sounds familiar, congratulations. You've discovered one of history's oldest traditions. The hairstyles were different. The shoes were pointier. The questionable decisions simply involved more livestock and fewer smartphones. In fact, if you dropped into a medieval village wearing modern clothes, probably recognized the teenagers immediately, not because of what they wore, but because one of them would almost certainly be attempting a dangerous idea that began with the words, "Watch this." And that's exactly what makes medieval teenagers so fascinating. Beneath the chain mail, wool tunics, church bells, and muddy roads were young people who laughed too loudly, fell in love too quickly, underestimated consequences with breathtaking confidence, and possessed the remarkable ability to convince every adult around them that the next generation was clearly doomed. As you'll soon discover, they were absolute professionals at it. If you think teenagers invented dressing specifically to annoy their parents, medieval history has some excellent news for you. The year is somewhere around 1350. You finally earned a little money as an apprentice. Or perhaps your parents reluctantly bought you a new outfit after months of complaints. Naturally, your first thought isn't, "I'll purchase something practical." No, your first thought is, "How can I make every respectable adult in town sigh loudly?" Welcome to medieval fashion. Contrary to popular belief, people in the Middle Ages didn't all wander around wearing identical brown sacks. Teenagers especially loved standing out. Bright reds, greens, blues, striped fabrics, flashy belts, colorful hose, fancy hats, embroidered sleeves, and shoes with ridiculously long pointed toes became the medieval equivalent of telling the world, "I'm cooler than everyone else." Adults absolutely hated it. Town councils across Europe repeatedly passed laws trying to limit what young people could wear, not because colorful clothes were dangerous, but because teenagers kept dressing above their social status. Apparently, nothing ruined society faster than an apprentice looking slightly too fashionable. Imagine your mayor holding an emergency meeting because Kevin, the blacksmith's apprentice, bought an expensive belt. Civilization was clearly hanging by a shoes became one of the biggest battlegrounds. The fashionable style featured long pointed tips known today as pulanes that sometimes stretched several inches beyond the actual foot. Walking in them was already awkward enough. Working in them made even less sense. But practicality has never been the strongest influence on teenage fashion. Some wealthy young nobles wore points so long they had to tie them to their legs with little cords just to avoid tripping over themselves. If you've ever watched someone sacrifice comfort entirely because something looked cool, congratulations, you already understand medieval fashion. Hair caused just as much outrage. Older generations complained constantly that young men spent too much time styling their hair instead of working. They curled it, trimmed it into fashionable shapes, and occasionally wore it much longer than conservative adults considered respectable. Priests wrote sermons criticizing vanity, while fathers wondered why their sons owned combs but mysteriously couldn't remember where they had left the shovel. Girls experimented, too. Braided hairstyles became increasingly elaborate. Ribbons appeared everywhere, and fashionable headwear changed almost as quickly as gossip spread through the marketplace. The complaints sound almost identical to modern ones. Why are your trousers so tight? Why are your shoes shaped like that? Why spend money on clothes when you already have perfectly good ones? 800 years later, parents are still asking exactly the same questions. The more things changed, the pointier the shoes became. And for medieval teenagers, that was probably reason enough to wear them. If medieval teenagers had social media, one group would almost certainly have filled their pages with gloomy poetry, dramatic sunset drawings, and captions like, "Nobody understands me," except they wouldn't have posted it online. They would have written it on expensive parchment, sighed heavily beside a castle window, and recited it to anyone unfortunate enough to make eye contact. Believe it or not, the Middle Ages had their own version of emotionally dramatic teenagers. If you belonged to a noble family, there was a good chance you'd become obsessed with the fashionable idea of courtly love. According to poets, true love wasn't supposed to be simple or happy. That would be far too convenient. Real romance meant longing endlessly for someone you probably couldn't marry, writing poems about your suffering, and staring thoughtfully into the distance whenever possible. You were expected to be miserable with style. The more impossible your love was, the more respectable your heartbreak became. Imagine spending 3 months composing a beautiful poem because someone smiled at you once during a feast. Then, discovering they were already promised to another noble, then writing 4 more poems about how devastating this was. Modern teenagers call it being left unread. Medieval teenagers called it literature. Young nobles adored romantic songs performed by wandering minstrels. These songs spoke of impossible devotion, endless waiting, sleepless nights, and lovers separated by duty or family honor. After listening to enough of them, it became surprisingly easy to convince yourself that your own life was a tragic masterpiece, even if your greatest hardship that week had been losing a falconry competition. Adults naturally found all of this rather exhausting. Parents wanted heirs, political alliances, and respectable marriages. Teenagers wanted destiny. The two rarely agreed. Even outside noble society, young people experienced heartbreak just as intensely. Village dances, church festivals, and market fairs gave boys and girls opportunities to meet, flirt, and occasionally embarrass themselves in spectacular fashion. A rejected invitation to dance could feel like the end of the world, despite the inconvenient fact that tomorrow everyone still had to milk cows together. You couldn't exactly transfer schools. Monks also complained about young people becoming distracted by romance instead of focusing on work or religion. It's almost comforting that even 8 centuries ago, adults believed teenagers spent entirely too much time thinking about each other. Some habits simply refused to go extinct. Of course, not every quiet teenager was secretly composing heartbreaking poetry. Sometimes you simply wandered into the woods because it was one of the few places where nobody expected you to carry water, stack firewood, clean tools, feed chickens, or explain why your friend had somehow fallen into the mill pond again. Solitude was cheaper than therapy. So, while medieval teenagers never dyed their hair black or listened to sad playlists, they absolutely understood dramatic emotions, impossible crushes, and the overwhelming certainty that nobody in history had ever suffered quite as much as they had. History, as always, politely disagrees. If medieval villages had teenagers, medieval cities had apprentices, and if villages occasionally complained about young people causing trouble, cities practically budgeted for it. At first glance, becoming an apprentice sounded wonderfully respectable. Around the age of 13 or 14, you left your family and moved into the home of a master craftsman. Perhaps you would become a blacksmith, a baker, a cooper, a mason, or a tailor. Over the next several years, you would learn a valuable trade, eventually earn your freedom, and hopefully make a decent living. That was the official version. The unofficial version involved a house full of teenagers living together, working long hours, possessing more energy than common sense, and having almost no private supervision once the workday ended. You can probably guess what happened next. Apprentices worked from sunrise until dusk, often 6 days a week. They swept workshops, carried supplies, cleaned tools, pumped bellows, fetched water, and performed every unpleasant task their master could think of before they were trusted with real craftsmanship. By evening, they were tired. Unfortunately, tired did not mean sensible. As soon as work ended, groups of apprentices poured into the streets, looking for entertainment. Sometimes that meant friendly games. Sometimes it meant wrestling. Sometimes it meant singing loudly through narrow streets. Long after respectable people had gone to bed, and sometimes it meant discovering that the apprentices from the neighboring workshop had been making jokes about your trade. Clearly, diplomacy was no longer an option. Cities across Europe recorded countless fights between rival groups of apprentices. Bakers argued with butchers. Weavers insulted fullers. Shoemakers clashed with tailor. Historians aren't always certain what started these disputes. It was often something incredibly important, like an insult or a hat or someone looking at someone else for slightly too long. The exact reason usually disappeared from the records. The bruises did not gild. Masters constantly complained that apprentices disappeared when work needed doing, yet somehow reappeared the moment food was served. It's an extraordinary coincidence that has survived into the modern workplace. Many apprentices also developed reputations for sneaking into taverns whenever they could. Officially, they were there to enjoy a mug of ale after a hard day's work. Unofficially, they were there because every other apprentice was there. Peer pressure did not wait for the invention of high school curfews attempted to solve the problem. Many towns required young people to return home after the evening bell. Patrols walked the streets looking for anyone still wandering about. This worked almost as well as telling teenagers not to do something because it's dangerous. Being caught outside after curfew could lead to fines, punishment from your master, or an uncomfortable conversation involving disappointed adults using phrases like, "I'm not angry," which, even in the Middle Ages, was usually much worse. Despite all the complaints, apprentices were the future of every medieval city. They would become the craftsmen who built houses, forged swords, baked bread, and kept towns alive. But first, they had to survive the remarkably difficult challenge of being 16. History suggests that was often the harder job. If you ever find yourself thinking, "My parents just don't understand me," medieval history has some comforting news. Neither did yours. The average medieval household wasn't exactly built for privacy. Entire families often lived, ate, worked, argued, and slept in the same building. If you wanted a dramatic exit after an argument, your options were fairly limited. You could storm outside and then probably run into your uncle, feeding the pigs. Escaping emotionally was difficult when everyone knew exactly where you had gone. Parents depended on their children. This wasn't just about teaching responsibility. A farm needed every pair of hands it could get. A workshop relied on apprentices. Every chore left unfinished usually became someone else's problem, and that someone was often your father. Which explains why medieval parents developed a remarkable ability to become irritated before breakfast. Have you fed the chickens? Yes. The hungry chickens disagree. The arguments themselves would sound surprisingly familiar today. Parents insisted you were wasting time. You insisted you were just about to do it. Parents wanted you to focus on work. You wanted to see your friends. Parents believed you spent entirely too much time thinking about boys or girls. You believed they were ruining your life. Human civilization, it turns out, has been running this script for centuries. One major difference was that medieval parents had much bigger decisions to make on your behalf. By your mid-teens, conversations about your future became unavoidable. If you were a boy, would you stay on the farm, learn a trade, join a noble household, perhaps even fight in a lord's army someday? If you were a girl, discussions about marriage could begin surprisingly early. Families often thought about practical matters first: land, alliances, financial security, and reputation. Meanwhile, you were probably wondering whether the person you liked might also be attending the next village festival. Priorities rarely aligned. Teenagers also had an unfortunate habit of believing they knew better than adults, who had somehow survived 40 years. Without their advice, parents would explain why something was a terrible idea. You would confidently ignore them. Several hours later, you would accidentally prove them correct. This educational method remains remarkably popular. Church officials frequently preached that young people should obey their parents without complaint. The fact that they repeated this message so often suggests the audience wasn't listening particularly carefully. Medieval sermons are full of warnings against stubborn youth, disrespectful children, and sons who answered back. Apparently, eye-rolling existed long before mirrors became affordable. Not every household was filled with constant arguments. Of course, many families were close, working side by side every day, and relying on one another to survive difficult harvests, harsh winters, and unexpected illness. But affection didn't eliminate frustration. Imagine spending 12 straight hours together every single day. No television, no headphones, no separate bedrooms, no convenient excuse about your phone battery dying, just endless proximity. By the end of harvest season, even the saints might have considered taking a very long walk. Yet, despite the disagreements, parents understood something teenagers often didn't. Childhood was ending quickly. The carefree years were disappearing, replaced by responsibilities that would last a lifetime. Adults worried because they knew how hard the future could be. Teenagers, meanwhile, were busy arguing about whether they could stay out just a little longer. Some conversations, it seems, never go out of fashion. If you think teenagers only started inventing terrible ideas after electricity was discovered, medieval history would like a brief word. You and your friends have finally escaped work for the evening. Nobody wants to think about apprenticeships, chores, or tomorrow's endless list of responsibilities. Naturally, someone says the four most dangerous words in any language. I have an idea no good story has ever started there. Medieval records are filled with complaints about young people pulling pranks that ranged from mildly amusing to, "Please explain this," to the town magistrate. One favorite target was livestock. Not because anyone disliked the animals, but because moving a pig, goat, or donkey into the wrong place created absolute chaos. Imagine opening your workshop in the morning to discover 3 confused sheep calmly inspecting your expensive tools. The sheep were innocent. Your friends definitely weren't. Then there were the carts. A group of bored teenagers could quietly move someone's cart during the night and leave the owner searching half the village the next morning. It wasn't exactly grand larceny. It was simply being spectacularly annoying. Church bells were another irresistible temptation. These bells weren't just decorative. They announced fires, funerals, emergencies, religious services, and important town meetings. Ringing one at the wrong time sent people running into the streets expecting disaster. Instead, they found 6 teenagers trying very hard not to laugh. Oddly enough, priests failed to appreciate the joke. Some young people thought it would be hilarious to knock on doors late at night before disappearing into the darkness. Others threw mud, fruit, or handfuls of straw at their friends during festivals, usually starting chain reactions that involved dozens of people who had absolutely nothing to do with the original prank. History rarely remembers who threw the first apple. It remembers the brawl that followed. Festivals made everything worse. Large crowds, music, dancing, ale, and very little supervision created conditions that every teenager interpreted as unlimited opportunity. Someone climbed a roof. Someone else climbed after him because apparently bad ideas become better when they're shared. Soon, half the square was watching adults attempt to convince 2 laughing teenagers that rooftops were not intended for recreational purposes. The adults were unsuccessful. Even monasteries weren't completely safe. Monks occasionally complained about local youths sneaking near monastery grounds simply to make noise, shout jokes, or interrupt the peaceful silence. Imagine dedicating your life to quiet contemplation only to hear someone outside imitating a chicken for reasons known only to teenagers. Faith is tested in many ways. Sometimes it wears muddy boots. Of course, not every prank stayed harmless. A joke involving fire could quickly become terrifying in towns built largely from wood and thatch. A prank involving frightened horses could injure people. What began as laughter sometimes ended with angry neighbors, damaged property, and an appearance before local officials. Which raises an important question. Did punishment stop teenagers from trying again? Absolutely not. If anything, medieval adults spent centuries writing new rules, because every generation of young people discovered entirely new ways to ignore the old ones. Some traditions are simply impossible to outlaw. If you imagine medieval teenagers quietly heading home after work with a wholesome desire to reflect on the day's lessons, you have clearly never met a group of teenage boys with absolutely nothing scheduled for the evening. Once the work was finished and the master stopped watching, you and your friends naturally gathered together. At first, it was innocent enough. You talked about work, complained about your parents, laughed about someone's embarrassing mistake, and argued over who was strongest. Then someone from the next street walked past. Unfortunately, he looked slightly too confident. Across medieval Europe, towns often developed fierce neighborhood rivalries. Teenagers living on one street formed close groups with the boys they had grown up beside. Those from another district did exactly the same. Nobody officially declared war. It simply happened. One insult led to another. One shove became 3. Suddenly, 30 young men were charging at each other with the enthusiasm of people who had completely forgotten how much tomorrow's bruises were going to hurt. Town records are full of complaints about these fights. Sometimes they broke out during festivals, sometimes after church, sometimes on ordinary afternoons, because apparently Tuesday seemed like an excellent day for public violence. The reasons were often spectacularly unimpressive. Someone bumped into someone, someone borrowed something and forgot to return it, someone called someone else's friend an idiot. To be fair, medieval insults were apparently considered legally binding invitations to settle matters immediately. Weapons were technically forbidden in many towns, especially after dark. Local governments repeatedly ordered young men not to carry swords, knives, clubs, or staffs through the streets. Teenagers responded by carrying them anyway. It's almost as if rules weren't their strongest interest. Not every confrontation became a full-scale brawl. Often it was more about reputation than actual fighting. You couldn't let another group think you were weak. If someone challenged your friends, you stood beside them. Were you certain what had happened? Not really. Had you asked for both sides of the story? Of course not. Your friend said, "They're looking for trouble." That was apparently sufficient evidence. Adults watched these rivalries with increasing frustration. Merchants hated them because they frightened customers. Priests hated them because they disrupted public order. Town officials hated them because every fight meant paperwork, fines, witnesses, and yet another meeting about the problem with today's youth. Some council members probably dreamed of inventing adulthood several years earlier just to calm everyone down. The funniest part is that these sworn enemies often became perfectly respectable adults later in life. The apprentice who spent his evenings chasing rivals through muddy streets eventually became the town baker. The boy throwing punches at the harvest festival grew into a respected merchant with 3 children who constantly complained about teenagers. History has a magnificent sense of humor, because somewhere decades later, that same former troublemaker was undoubtedly shaking his head at a noisy group of 15-year-olds and muttering the immortal words, "Young people just aren't what they used to be." His former opponents probably nodded in complete agreement. If there's one thing medieval adults underestimated, it was a teenager's ability to become hopelessly in love after approximately 7 seconds of eye contact. You're 15 years old. You've just spent the entire morning hauling sacks of grain, chopping wood, or learning how not to destroy your master's expensive tools. Then you arrive at the village festival. Across the square, someone smiles at you. Well, there goes your ability to think rationally for the rest of the week. Despite what films often suggest, medieval villages weren't places where young people lived completely separate lives. Markets, church services, harvest celebrations, weddings, saints' feast days, and seasonal festivals brought everyone together. For teenagers, these weren't simply community events. They were opportunities. You weren't just attending the May Day celebration. You were hoping someone specific would be there, preferably looking in your direction. Boys suddenly discovered fascinating reasons to walk past the same market stall 6 different times. Girls somehow found themselves helping near the village well far more often than strictly necessary. Historians can't fully explain this remarkable coincidence. Teenagers probably could. Dancing became one of the safest ways to flirt. During festivals, music echoed through village squares while young people formed circles or danced in pairs under the watchful eyes of parents who pretended not to be watching. The key word there is pretended. Your mother noticed everything. Your father noticed even more. He simply expressed it by clearing his throat from 20 feet away. Courtship wasn't always straightforward. Families had opinions. Neighbors had opinions. The priest almost certainly had opinions. In medieval villages, privacy was about as rare as indoor plumbing. If you embarrassed yourself, congratulations. The entire village would probably hear about it before sunset. Love tokens also became surprisingly popular. A ribbon, a carved piece of wood, a flower, or even a simple handmade gift could quietly communicate feelings without saying a word. Unfortunately, your friends usually noticed immediately, and friends have possessed exactly the same emotional maturity throughout history. Oh, so that's why you've combed your hair today. Look who's trying to impress somebody. You immediately denied everything. Nobody believed you. Jealousy also made regular appearances. If another boy asked the person you liked to dance first, your evening could be ruined before the music had properly begun. Rivalries that began over absolutely nothing somehow became matters of enormous personal importance. From the outside, adults often found the whole thing amusing. Many had once experienced exactly the same emotions, although they preferred to pretend otherwise. Modern parents worry about teenagers spending too much time playing video games. Medieval parents had a different concern. They worried their teenagers might accidentally knock out half the village during a football match. To be fair, that was a perfectly reasonable concern. After another long day of work, you and your friends still had enough energy to sprint across fields, wrestle each other into the mud, throw heavy objects for fun, and invent competitions that would make modern insurance companies quietly close their offices forever. The most famous game was medieval football. Calling it football, however, is being extraordinarily generous. There were very few rules. Sometimes there were hundreds of players. Entire villages competed against neighboring villages. The field could stretch across roads, streams, gardens, and open farmland. The objective was simple enough. Get the ball to a certain location. How you accomplished that was open to interpretation. Kicking was allowed. Pushing was expected. Being tackled into a hedge was practically tradition. Broken windows, flattened fences, and deeply confused livestock often became innocent victims of the day's entertainment. It's no surprise that kings occasionally tried banning the sport altogether. The teenagers naturally responded by continuing to play it anyway. Some traditions are simply stronger than royal authority. Wrestling was another favorite pastime. Almost every village had young men eager to prove who was strongest. It didn't require expensive equipment, only confidence and a willingness to land face first in the dirt. Conveniently, medieval villages had an endless supply of dirt. Archery competitions were equally popular. Young men were expected to practice regularly. Because kingdoms depended on skilled archers during wartime, English kings even ordered their subjects to spend Sundays practicing with the long bow instead of wasting time on less useful activities. Teenagers heard this and thought, finally, an official excuse to shoot arrows all afternoon. Probably the only government program that sounded genuinely exciting. Then there was quarter-staff fighting. Imagine picking up a sturdy wooden pole, nearly as tall as yourself, and agreeing that hitting your friends with it counted as recreation. Surprisingly, this was considered excellent training. Even climbing became a competitive sport, although nobody officially admitted it. Trees, walls, rooftops, barns. If something could be climbed, a teenager eventually attempted it, usually after someone confidently declared, "Bet you can't." Those 4 words have probably caused more unnecessary injuries than any plague in history. Adults complained constantly about dangerous games. Priests preached moderation. Town officials issued regulations. Parents warned about broken bones and unnecessary risks. Teenagers listened politely, then immediately challenged each other to see who could jump the widest ditch. Some things never change, whether you were racing through muddy fields, wrestling beside a river, or chasing a football through 3 different farms, while someone's furious goose attacked everyone equally. Medieval sports weren't just about winning. They were about showing courage, impressing your friends, catching the attention of someone you secretly liked, and proving that common sense was an obstacle best ignored until at least your 20s. history suggests that strategy remained remarkably popular. If there's one skill medieval teenagers mastered with remarkable consistency, it was believing they had a better plan than every adult around them. Sometimes they were right. Most of the time. Well, that's why court records exist. By the time you reached your mid-teens, everyone seemed to have your future mapped out. Your parents expected you to continue the family trade. Your master expected years of loyal service. The local priest expected respectable behavior. The Lord expected obedience. The only person who hadn't been consulted was you. Naturally, this created problems. One of the biggest was apprentices running away. An apprenticeship could last anywhere from 5 to 7 years, sometimes even longer. You lived in your master's house, followed his rules, worked exhausting hours, and had very little freedom. A good master could teach you a valuable profession and treat you almost like family. A bad master, let's just say, he provided excellent motivation to become an excellent runner. Records from medieval towns mention apprentices disappearing without permission, abandoning their contracts, or simply deciding that another city looked considerably more appealing. The escape plan usually sounded simple. I'll just leave. The complicated part came afterward. You had no wages saved, few possessions, and no convenient train station waiting outside the city gates. Walking to another town could take days, and if your master reported you, local officials might send you straight back. Freedom, it turned out, involved considerably more walking than expected. Some teenagers ignored rules for less dramatic reasons. Curfew, more of a suggestion. Church attendance, I'll definitely be there next week. Helping with harvest, my back suddenly hurts. It was an astonishing medical condition that disappeared the moment friends suggested going swimming in the river. Parents remained unconvinced. Then there was the eternal question of marriage. Families often had practical expectations. They considered property, reputation, financial stability, and useful alliances. Teenagers, unfortunately, insisted on introducing emotions into the discussion. Some young couples secretly met despite their parents' objections. Others exchanged small gifts, arranged quiet meetings during festivals, or found excuses to cross paths while fetching water or visiting the market. The entire village usually noticed. Within 3 days, villages were wonderfully efficient at sharing information. If you whispered something on Monday, your grandmother somehow knew by Tuesday morning, and she lived 2 villages away. Occasionally, young people simply disappeared together, not forever, just long enough to convince both families that perhaps allowing the marriage would be easier than dealing with the gossip. It wasn't common, but it happened often. Enough for medieval authorities to take notice. Adults constantly complained that teenagers were impatient. They wanted independence immediately, respect immediately, freedom immediately. The amusing part is that every older generation had once behaved exactly the same way. They simply remembered themselves as being much wiser. History strongly suggests otherwise, because whether you were slipping out after curfew, sneaking away to meet someone you liked, abandoning an apprenticeship, or confidently announcing that every adult in your life was completely wrong, you were participating in one of humanity's oldest traditions. Believing that this generation was the first to discover freedom, and that nobody over 30 could possibly understand it. Every teenager eventually has that one moment. You and your friends have spent the last 5 minutes confidently explaining why your latest idea is completely harmless. Then an adult appears. Unfortunately, this adult carries an official badge. The Middle Ages had no shortage of laws. aimed specifically at young people. In fact, the more you read medieval town records, the more you realize that local governments spent an astonishing amount of time trying to answer one impossible question. How do we stop teenagers from behaving like teenagers? Their success rate was modest. Large, medieval towns appointed officials to patrol the streets, especially after dark. Their job was to keep the peace, stop fights, prevent theft, and make sure everyone obeyed the evening curfew. Your job, apparently, was making theirs considerably more difficult. If you were caught wandering the streets long after the curfew bell had rung, expect uncomfortable questions. Where were you going? Why weren't you home? Who were your friends? Why does one of them still have a chicken under his arm? Nobody wanted to answer that last one. Street fights were one of the biggest headaches for medieval authorities. Whenever groups of apprentices or village youths started throwing punches, the watch often had to break them apart before someone reached for a knife or club. Town officials weren't necessarily shocked by the fighting. They were simply tired of writing reports about it. Some cities imposed fines. Others locked offenders in jail overnight to give them time to reconsider their life choices. Given that medieval prisons were cold, filthy, and smelled like several terrible decisions layered on top of each other, one night was usually enough. Usually, property damage brought even bigger problems: breaking market stalls, damaging fences, smashing windows, knocking over someone's carefully stacked firewood. These weren't harmless jokes to medieval families. A damaged cart or broken tool could seriously affect someone's livelihood, meaning the prank that seemed hilarious yesterday suddenly became very expensive today. Parents often ended up paying for mistakes they hadn't even witnessed. Needless to say, they were not delighted. Church courts also dealt with young people from time to time, especially if the trouble involved disorder during religious services, public misbehavior, or ignoring important holy days. Imagine interrupting a sermon because your friend dared you to make sheep noises. The priest would remember your name, probably forever. The funny thing is that medieval judges often showed surprising patience toward younger offenders. They understood that young people were impulsive, easily influenced by friends, and spectacularly overconfident. Some things have always been obvious. What mattered most was whether you learned from the experience. Did you apologize? Did you pay the fine? Did you stop causing trouble? The answer to that final question was occasionally, because if history teaches us anything, it's that no punishment has ever completely cured a teenager of believing, next time we'll be smarter. History also teaches us there is almost always a next time, which explains why medieval law books kept getting thicker, while teenagers somehow kept finding entirely new ways to end up in them. The sun has finally disappeared behind the rooftops. The church bell rings to announce the evening curfew. Respectable citizens begin closing their shutters, putting out lamps, and settling in for the night. You look at your friends. Your friends look at you. Nobody says it aloud, but everyone is thinking exactly the same thing. So, are we actually going home? Not immediately. Despite the popular image of medieval towns becoming completely silent after sunset, nighttime had a strange kind of energy, especially for young people. The streets grew darker, the crowds became smaller, and suddenly every harmless adventure felt twice as exciting simply because an adult had told you not to do it. Teenagers have always found darkness incredibly persuasive. If you were an apprentice, your master probably expected you to be asleep after another exhausting day of work. Instead, you quietly slipped outside to meet your friends, not because you had an important meeting, because someone claimed a traveling musician had arrived at the tavern. That was reason enough. Taverns became natural gathering places. They weren't just places to drink. People shared news, listened to music, played games, told stories, and laughed about the day's disasters. Travelers brought rumors from distant towns. Merchants exchanged gossip, and local musicians filled the room with songs everyone somehow knew. You, meanwhile, were pretending not to notice someone sitting across the room. Your friends noticed immediately. They were kind enough to point it out by smiling in the most suspicious way imaginable. Excellent support system. Of course, not every teenager was legally supposed to spend evenings in taverns. Some masters forbade it, parents certainly discouraged it, which made it even more attractive. There's something almost magical about forbidden places. They become approximately 3 times more interesting the moment an adult says, "You're not going." Outside the taverns, town streets became much quieter. Without street lights, medieval nights were genuinely dark. Moonlight helped, but narrow alleys could feel mysterious, even to people who walked them every day. Every strange noise suddenly sounded larger. A cat knocked over a bucket. You briefly prepared to fight a dragon. Teenagers loved telling ghost stories during these nighttime walks. Every abandoned ruin supposedly contained spirits. Every lonely crossroads had its own legend. Every ancient tree had apparently witnessed something supernatural. The stories grew dramatically better. After everyone agreed they definitely weren't scared. Nobody believed that statement. Even the person saying it. Town watches patrolled many larger cities, carrying lanterns and listening for trouble. Their appearance usually produced one of 2 reactions. If you had done nothing wrong, you greeted them politely. If you had done something wrong, you suddenly became fascinated by the speed at which you could walk in the opposite direction without technically running. By morning, everyone returned to work as though nothing unusual had happened. The baker baked bread, the blacksmith forged iron, the apprentices swept the workshop, and every teenager silently wondered what everyone was doing after sunset tonight. Because medieval nights weren't just about breaking curfew. They were about tasting a tiny piece of independence before adulthood arrived. Whether the adults approved or not, one afternoon, you're racing your friends across a muddy field, laughing, because one of them has somehow fallen into a ditch for the 2nd time this week. The next morning, someone hands you real responsibility, no ceremony, no inspiring speech, no helpful booklet titled, "Congratulations, you're an adult now." Just work. The strangest part about growing up in the Middle Ages was how suddenly everyone expected you to stop behaving like a teenager. There wasn't a universal birthday when adulthood officially began. Instead, it arrived differently, depending on who you were and where you lived. Maybe you finished your apprenticeship. Maybe your father became too old to manage the farm alone. Maybe your family arranged your marriage. Maybe war arrived before any of those things had a chance to happen. Whatever the reason, one day people stopped saying he's just a boy. Now they were saying he's responsible. Those are 2 very different sentences. If you had completed an apprenticeship, you could finally become a journeyman. After years of sweeping floors, carrying heavy loads, and being blamed for mistakes you didn't even witness, you were now trusted to produce quality work yourself, which sounded wonderful until you realized mistakes were now entirely your fault. No more hiding behind the master. If you stayed in the countryside, adulthood often meant taking over larger parts of the family farm. Suddenly, the harvest wasn't simply your parents' concern. If the crops failed, they were your concern, too. That funny little game, called I'll Deal With It, later became considerably less entertaining. Marriage changed everything as well. Many people married in their late, considerably less entertaining, greatly depending on wealth, location, and circumstance. Marriage wasn't simply about romance. It meant managing a household, raising children, producing enough food, paying rents, maintaining property, and surviving winters that didn't particularly care whether you felt prepared. Life had an extraordinary habit of assuming you were. Young noblemen faced another challenge: military service. Training with swords during childhood had seemed exciting enough. Actually, leading men into battle was rather less glamorous. The armor became heavier. The consequences became permanent. For young women, adulthood meant equally demanding responsibilities. Running a household required remarkable skill. Bread had to be baked, clothing repaired, food preserved, accounts remembered, servants supervised if the family could afford them, children cared for, and countless daily problems solved before they became disasters. Nobody called it management. It absolutely was. The amusing thing is that adults often suspiciously selective memories. The former apprentice who had once started tavern arguments now complained that young people lacked discipline. The former village troublemaker insisted teenagers had become reckless. The man who had climbed church roofs for fun somehow became convinced he had always been perfectly sensible. History suggests his friends would have disagreed. Perhaps that is the final step into adulthood. Not paying taxes, not getting married, not finishing your apprenticeship, but forgetting just how wonderfully ridiculous you were at 16, and becoming absolutely certain that the next generation is somehow much worse. Some traditions are simply too old to disappear. After everything you've seen, from the impossible fashion trends and spectacularly bad ideas to midnight adventures and public fist fights, you might expect the ending of this story to reveal that medieval teenagers were completely different from the teenagers of today. History has other plans. Strip away the castles, the wool tunics, the muddy roads, and the church bells, and you're left with something surprisingly familiar. You, or at least someone very much like you. 800 years ago, you still wanted freedom before you were quite ready for it. You wanted adults to trust you while simultaneously giving them excellent reasons not to. You believed your friends knew everything, your parents understood nothing, and the future would somehow work itself out. It usually did. Eventually, medieval adults complained endlessly that young people were lazy, disrespectful, obsessed with appearance, distracted by romance, unwilling to work hard enough, and constantly inventing new ways to waste time. If you've heard those complaints before, congratulations. You've discovered the longest running conversation in human history. In fact, every generation seems absolutely convinced that they were the last sensible one. The Romans complained about young people. Medieval parents complained about young people. Victorian parents complained about young people. Today, someone is probably complaining about young people while a teenager nearby is confidently explaining why the adults just don't get it. The cycle remains beautifully unbroken. Of course, medieval teenagers faced challenges that would seem unimaginable today. Many left home before they were old enough to vote. By modern standards, they worked exhausting days, survived deadly diseases, and lived in a world where a poor harvest could threaten an entire community. Yet somehow, even surrounded by those hardships, they still found time to laugh with friends, fall hopelessly in love, wear clothes their parents hated, stay out later than they should, pull ridiculous pranks, argue with authority, and chase excitement whenever life gave them the smallest opportunity. Human nature, it seems, has always been stronger than circumstance. Perhaps That's why medieval records are so enjoyable to read. They're filled with kings, bishops, knights, and great battles. But hidden between those famous stories were ordinary teenagers trying to figure out who they were. Sometimes brilliantly, often disastrously, almost always entertainingly. And maybe that's the biggest surprise of all. The Middle Ages weren't populated by silent, gloomy people endlessly struggling through life without smiling. They joked, argued, flirted, competed, made terrible decisions, embarrassed themselves in public, and occasionally forced exhausted adults to invent entirely new rules because the old ones clearly weren't working. In other words, they grew up just like every generation before them, and every generation since. So the next time someone claims that teenagers have completely lost their minds and that things were far better back in the old days, remember the medieval apprentice, wearing absurdly pointy shoes, sneaking out after curfew to meet friends, starting a fight over an insult he couldn't even remember the next morning. Then arriving home convinced that none of it had been his fault. History would simply smile and quietly reply, "We've seen this before." When you think of ancient fashion, your mind probably jumps straight to white marble statues wrapped in flowing robes, Egyptian pharaohs wearing impossible amounts of gold, or Roman senators looking permanently overdressed for the weather. It all seems wonderfully distant, preserved behind museum glass and history books thick enough to stun an ox. But look a little closer, and something rather surprising begins to happen. Many of the clothes, accessories, and beauty habits you see every day are not modern inventions at all. They are simply very old ideas wearing new labels. Fashion, despite its reputation for constantly changing, is remarkably stubborn. It loves pretending to reinvent itself while quietly borrowing from civilizations that disappeared thousands of years ago. Humans have always wanted to look attractive, display status, stay comfortable, and occasionally make their neighbors just a little bit jealous. The methods change, the motivations rarely do. Thousands of years before fashion magazines declared what was in or out, people along the Nile River carefully applied cosmetics before leaving home. Greek craftsmen stitched elegant sandals that would not look entirely out of place on today's beaches. Roman women layered garments in ways that modern designers still imitate, while wealthy Persians experimented with luxurious fabrics and tailored clothing that would influence fashion for centuries. Even jewelry tells the same story. Rings, necklaces, bracelets, earrings, hairpins, and decorative belts have survived not because they are ancient curiosities, but because they simply work. Gold still shines exactly as it did when Egyptian nobles admired it beneath the desert sun. Pearls remain elegant despite having been fashionable since long before Julius Caesar was making political enemies at an impressive pace. Of course, not every ancient trend deserves a comeback. Some hairstyles required enough oil to fry tonight's dinner, and certain cosmetics contained ingredients that modern doctors would describe with considerable concern. Looking fashionable was occasionally a dangerous hobby. Vanity has always demanded sacrifices, although preferably not involving lead poisoning. One of the biggest misconceptions about ancient clothing is that everyone dressed alike. In reality, fashion changed constantly, depending on wealth, occupation, region, climate, religion, and social status. A Roman senator dressed very differently from a Roman baker, just as an Egyptian queen hardly resembled the farmer harvesting grain outside Memphis. Over the next chapters, you'll discover that ancient wardrobes were far more sophisticated than most people imagine. From timeless sandals to layered clothing, from perfumes to cosmetics, from carefully chosen colors to luxurious fabrics, many of today's biggest fashion trends are not new creations at all. They are simply history's favorite outfits making yet another entrance, proving that while civilizations may rise and fall, good style is remarkably difficult to bury. If there is one piece of ancient fashion that absolutely refused to stay in the past, it is the humble sandal. Long before sneakers conquered the world, and long before anyone argued about limited edition trainers, people had already discovered that a flat sole attached to your foot with a few well-placed straps was surprisingly difficult to improve upon. The story begins thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt. Walking barefoot on cool stone floors inside temples was pleasant enough, but crossing hot desert sand was another matter entirely. Egyptians crafted sandals from woven papyrus reeds, palm fibers, leather, and occasionally wood. Simpler versions belonged to farmers and laborers, while elaborate sandals decorated with dyed leather, embroidery, or even gold leaf were reserved for the wealthy. Pharaohs took footwear particularly seriously. Some royal sandals featured images of Egypt's enemies painted onto the soles. Every step literally placed foreign rivals beneath the ruler's feet. It was political propaganda expressed through footwear. Modern branding suddenly feels rather unimaginative. As Mediterranean civilizations grew, so did sandal design. The Greeks transformed practicality into elegance. Their sandals were carefully shaped to fit the foot and secured with leather straps that wrapped gracefully around the ankle. Shoemakers experimented with different patterns, creating styles that distinguished men from women and citizens from soldiers. Beauty mattered immensely in Greek society. A well-crafted sandal complemented flowing garments and balanced the proportions of the body, reflecting the Greek fascination with harmony. Even footwear became part of their philosophy, that beauty and function should exist together. The Romans naturally approached the subject with typical efficiency. They created dozens of different sandal styles depending on occupation and status. Soldiers marched across Europe wearing sturdy military sandals called caligae, fitted with thick leather soles, reinforced by iron hobnails. These shoes endured mud, mountains, forests, and battlefields with remarkable reliability. Meanwhile, wealthy Roman citizens wore softer leather sandals indoors, while senators and magistrates often displayed distinctive footwear that immediately revealed their rank. In Rome, people could often judge your profession before you spoke simply by looking at your feet. Fast forward 2,000 years, and ancient ideas continue walking beside us. Every summer, fashion magazines enthusiastically announce the return of leather sandals, lace-up sandals, minimalist sandals, or the famous gladiator sandal. Designers unveiled them as exciting new collections, while somewhere an ancient Roman shoemaker would probably smile and quietly wonder what took everyone so long. Some trends disappear forever, others simply wait patiently until the world remembers how comfortable they were. Sandals belong firmly in the second category, proving that sometimes the oldest solutions remain the smartest ones. If you walked into the dressing room of a wealthy Egyptian noblewoman around 3,000 years ago, you might be surprised by how familiar it looked. There would be mirrors polished from bronze, carefully carved cosmetic containers, scented oils, small brushes, powders, and pigments arranged with impressive care. The only obvious difference would be the absence of electric lighting and someone explaining a 12-step skincare routine on social media. Ancient people did not simply throw on whatever was available. Cosmetics were a serious business, combining fashion, religion, medicine, and social status into a daily ritual. The Egyptians were perhaps the undisputed masters of ancient beauty. Both men and women regularly lined their eyes with black coal, creating the dramatic almond-shaped look that still appears on fashion runways today. The dark lines were undeniably beautiful, but they also served practical purposes. They reduced the glare of the powerful Egyptian sun and helped protect sensitive eyes from blowing sand. Some ingredients even had mild antibacterial properties, meaning that looking elegant occasionally came with genuine health benefits. It may be one of the few moments in beauty history when makeup could honestly claim to improve your well-being. Green eye shadow also became fashionable, made from crushed malachite, while red ochre provided color for lips and cheeks. Wealthier Egyptians stored these cosmetics inside beautifully carved stone jars or ivory containers, transforming makeup into both an art and a luxury. The Greeks admired a rather different ideal. They favored smoother, paler skin, believing it reflected refinement and a life spent indoors, rather than working beneath the Mediterranean sun. Women applied powders to lighten their complexions and used subtle colors on their lips and cheeks. Unfortunately, not every beauty secret aged as gracefully as the hairstyles. Some whitening products contained lead compounds which produced the desired appearance while quietly causing serious health problems. The mirror rarely mentioned this unfortunate detail. Roman women inherited many Greek practices but expanded them dramatically. Cosmetic recipes circulated throughout the empire. Perfumes arrived from Arabia and India, and expensive creams promised softer skin, fewer wrinkles, and greater beauty. If those promises sound familiar, congratulations. Advertising has apparently changed very little over the last 2,000 years. Even skin care became an obsession. Milk baths, honey masks, olive oil cleansers, and herbal lotions were all recommended by Roman writers. Some treatments genuinely moisturized the skin, while others probably worked best by convincing people they had invested enough money to feel prettier. Today, eyeliner, lipstick, blush, perfume, facial creams, and elaborate skin care routines fill bathroom shelves across the world. They may come in sleeker packaging, but the desire behind them remains ancient. Fashion evolves, trends come and go, but humanity's determination to look refreshed after a poor night's sleep appears to be completely timeless. Layering clothes feels like a thoroughly modern invention. Open any autumn fashion magazine and you'll find endless advice about combining jackets, scarves, sweaters, shirts, and accessories into the perfect outfit. Yet people mastered the art of layering thousands of years before anyone coined the phrase fall collection. The ancient world understood something that never goes out of style. Wearing several lighter garments is often far more practical than relying on one heavy piece of clothing. In ancient Greece, the basic wardrobe began with the chiton, a simple tunic made from linen or wool. But it rarely stopped there. Depending on the weather, the occasion, or a person's wealth. Another garment called the hymeation could be draped over the shoulders. It functioned somewhere between a cloak, a shawl, and a stylish overcoat. The fabric folded naturally around the body, creating elegant lines without a single button or zipper. How you arrange those folds mattered. A neatly draped hymeation suggested education, refinement, and self-control. Wrapping it carelessly might imply you had dressed in the dark or had lost an argument with your own wardrobe. The Romans adopted many Greek ideas, but made them even more structured. Most citizens wore a simple tunic close to the body, adding heavier cloaks when temperatures dropped. Senators and magistrates wore the famous toga over their tunics during official occasions. Though despite its iconic reputation, the toga was hardly everyday wear. In fact, many Romans found it bulky, uncomfortable, and difficult to manage. Wearing one properly often required practice or assistance. Imagine needing help simply to get dressed before attending a meeting. Suddenly, wrestling with a modern necktie feels considerably less dramatic. Beyond the Mediterranean, the Persians took layering to another level. Living across climates that ranged from hot plains to cold mountain regions, they developed wardrobes that included trousers, long-sleeved tunics, fitted jackets, cloaks, and decorative belts. Their clothing emphasized comfort while allowing freedom of movement, particularly for horsemen who spent long hours riding across the empire. Persian tailoring impressed neighboring civilizations so much that elements of it gradually spread westward. The idea of fitted outer garments worn over lighter layers would eventually influence fashion throughout Europe. Layering also allowed people to display wealth without saying a word. Rich fabrics beneath expensive cloaks, colorful borders peeking from underneath outer garments, embroidered sleeves, appearing at just the right moment, all quietly announced prosperity. Today, we casually combine shirts, jackets, coats, scarves, and cardigans without giving the concept much thought. Fashion brands present layered outfits as seasonal innovations every few years. The Greeks, Romans, and Persians might politely applaud the effort before pointing out that they had already perfected the look, while your great-great-great-grandparents' ancestors were still figuring out how sleeves worked. If you were suddenly transported into the marketplace of ancient Rome, Egypt, or Greece, one thing would become obvious almost immediately. People loved jewelry, not just kings and queens, but merchants, soldiers, priests, wealthy landowners, and anyone who could afford even the smallest decorative piece. Some things simply refused to go out of fashion. Gold is one of them. Ancient Egyptians believed jewelry was far more than decoration. Every necklace, bracelet, ring, or amulet could carry religious meaning, offer protection from evil spirits, or symbolize divine favor. Gold was especially treasured because it never tarnished. To the Egyptians, this eternal shine reflected the flesh of the gods themselves. A noble woman might wear elaborate collars made from rows of gold, turquoise, lapis lazuli, and carnelian beads. Broad bracelets covered both wrists, rings adorned nearly every finger, and earrings framed carefully styled hair. None of it was considered excessive. Quite the opposite, displaying beautiful craftsmanship honored both wealth and the gods. Modern jewelry advertisements often promise timeless elegance. Ancient Egypt quietly demonstrated what timeless actually looks like. The Greeks approached jewelry somewhat differently. They admired balance and subtle beauty. Gold wreaths resembling olive leaves, delicate earrings shaped like tiny animals, and necklaces with carefully worked pendants reflected their appreciation for nature and proportion. Jewelry complemented the body rather than overwhelming it, of course. If you happened to be exceptionally wealthy, subtlety occasionally took a holiday. Then came the Romans, who embraced nearly every style they encountered across their growing empire. There, jewelers imported pearls from the Persian Gulf, emeralds from Egypt, sapphires from distant lands, amber from northern Europe, and precious stones from as far away as India. Roman elites became passionate collectors. Rings multiplied, necklaces grew heavier, bracelets climbed higher up the arm, and gemstones became visible, proof that their owner possessed both wealth and excellent trade connections. Julius Caesar himself reportedly admired pearls so much that he helped turn them into one of Rome's greatest luxury obsessions. At extravagant banquets, guests often wore enough jewelry to finance a respectable farm. Not every ornament served purely decorative purposes. Signet rings carried family seals used to stamp wax on important documents, making them both fashionable and practical. They functioned almost like personal signatures worn on the hand. Today, engagement rings, gold chains, pearl earrings, charm bracelets, layered necklaces, and gemstone rings continue filling jewelry stores around the world. Their designs may be simplified or modernized, but their origins stretch astonishingly far into the past. People often say that diamonds are forever. Ancient history gently reminds us that humanity's desire to decorate itself with beautiful things has lasted even longer. Across empires that rose and vanished, through wars, plagues, and changing civilizations, gold kept shining, pearls kept glowing, and people kept admiring themselves in the nearest reflective surface. Some habits, it seems, are truly immortal. Long before fashion houses announced that this year's color was the one everyone absolutely needed, ancient civilizations already understood that color could speak louder than words. It could reveal your wealth, your profession, your family, your beliefs, and sometimes even whether people were expected to bow when you walked into the room. In the ancient world, color was never just decoration. Take purple for example. Today, you can buy a purple shirt without giving it much thought. 2,000 years ago, owning one could place you among the richest people in the Mediterranean. The famous Tyrian purple dye was extracted from tiny sea snails found along the eastern Mediterranean coast, producing even a small amount required thousands of shells and an astonishing amount of labor. The process was slow, unpleasant, and smelled so dreadful that dye workshops were usually built well away from cities. Apparently, luxury occasionally came with the aroma of something that had made several poor life choices. The expense made purple a symbol of enormous prestige. Roman emperors eventually claimed it almost exclusively for themselves. Certain shades became so closely associated with imperial power that wearing them without permission could lead to serious consequences. Accidentally copying the emperor's outfit was not considered a harmless fashion mistake. White carried its own importance. Greek citizens often wore clean white garments during festivals and religious ceremonies, symbolizing purity and respect for the gods. Roman politicians also favored bright white togas when campaigning for public office. In fact, the Latin word candidus, meaning brilliantly white, gave us the modern word candidate. The idea was simple enough. If your clothes looked spotless, perhaps your character did as well. History, of course, suggests that laundry alone was not always enough. Egyptians embraced lighter colors for practical reasons. White linen reflected the desert sun, while remaining comfortable in intense heat. Wealthier Egyptians sometimes Added colorful decorative borders dyed in reds, blues, greens, and yellows, using minerals and plant-based pigments. Bright colors demonstrated access to skilled craftsmen and expensive materials across Persia. Brilliant reds, deep blues, emerald greens, and richly patterned textiles became hallmarks of aristocratic dress. Royal courts celebrated vibrant fabrics that reflected both artistic sophistication and the empire's vast trade networks stretching across Asia. Today, color continues performing many of the same jobs it did in antiquity. Black suggests elegance. White still appears at weddings in much of the Western world. Purple retains an association with luxury. Gold evokes prestige, while red confidently attracts attention. Fashion may constantly invent new palettes, but the emotional language of color has remained surprisingly consistent. Thousands of years separate, as from the Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and Persians. Yet we still instinctively understand what they understood all along. Sometimes the first thing people notice about you is not the cut of your clothes. It is simply the color you chose to wear. Hair has always been one of fashion's favorite ways to make a statement. Unlike expensive jewelry or luxurious fabrics, nearly everyone had hair to work with, making it one of the most accessible forms of self-expression in the ancient world. Whether carefully curled, braided, tied, or piled high above the head, hairstyles often revealed just as much about a person as their clothing did. And surprisingly, many of today's most popular hairstyles would have looked perfectly at home thousands of years ago. Ancient Egypt offers one of the earliest examples. While many people kept their natural hair short for comfort in the desert heat, wigs became an entire fashion industry. Wealthy men and women owned several wigs for different occasions, crafted from human hair, wool, or plant fibers. These wigs could be braided, curled, scented with perfume, and decorated with beads or gold ornaments. Owning multiple hairstyles without waiting months for your hair to grow was apparently not invented by modern celebrity. The Greeks preferred a softer, more natural elegance. Women often wore long hair gathered into loose buns at the back of the head, secured with ribbons, pins, or decorative bands. Braids framed the face, while gentle curls were admired as symbols of beauty and refinement. These hairstyles were not rushed affairs. Household servants often spent considerable time arranging every strand. Looking effortlessly graceful usually required quite a bit of effort behind the scenes, a tradition that remains remarkably alive today. Roman fashion, however, took hairstyling to extraordinary levels. During the imperial period, wealthy Roman women competed to create increasingly elaborate hairstyles. Hair was curled into dozens of tiny ringlets, braided into towering structures, and supported by pins, wire frames, and occasionally even additional hair purchased from across the empire. Blonde hair imported from northern Europe became especially fashionable. Roman ladies sometimes wore wigs made from the hair of Germanic women, while darker hair from the East was equally prized. Fashion had become international long before anyone thought of calling it global. The more elaborate the hairstyle, the clearer the message. Its owner possessed enough wealth to employ servants whose full-time responsibility was arranging hair. Men followed trends as well. Julius Caesar famously combed his thinning hair forward to hide his baldness, while later emperors carefully influenced male hairstyles throughout the empire, apparently worrying about receding hairlines is another ancient tradition. Today, braided crowns, sleek buns, beach waves, curtain bangs, elaborate updo, hair extensions, and even wigs appear on red carpets and fashion shows around the world. The mirrors have changed. The styling tools have certainly improved. But if an ancient Roman or Greek stepped into a modern salon, they would recognize many of the hairstyles immediately. They might simply ask why everyone insists on calling them the newest trend, long before anyone walked through an airport duty-free shop, wondering whether they really needed another bottle of perfume. Ancient civilizations had already developed a fascination with fragrance. In fact, perfume is one of humanity's oldest luxury industries, dating back thousands of years. While clothing catches the eye, scent has always been the invisible finishing touch that completes an appearance. The Egyptians were among the first true masters of perfume. Fragrance surrounded nearly every aspect of daily life. Temples burned sweet smelling incense during religious ceremonies. Homes were filled with aromatic oils, and both men and women applied scented balms before attending feasts or important gatherings. Cleanliness and pleasant scents were closely linked with beauty, health, and even holiness. One of the most recognizable Egyptian beauty rituals involved wearing cones of scented wax on top of elaborate wigs during celebrations. As the evening grew warmer, the wax slowly melted, releasing perfumes made from myrrh, cinnamon, lotus flowers, and other precious ingredients. It sounds unusual today, but compared to spraying yourself with artificial ocean breeze before sitting in an air-conditioned office, perhaps it is not quite as strange as it first appears. The Greeks expanded perfume into an art form. Different fragrances suited different occasions. Athletes scented themselves after bathing. Guests applied perfume before banquets, and temples filled with carefully chosen aromas during religious festivals. Philosophers occasionally complained that people wore too much perfume, proving that someone has always believed everyone else is overdoing it. The Romans naturally embraced the trend with enthusiasm. Perfume flowed throughout Roman society. Wealthy citizens scented their hair, clothes, furniture, dining rooms, and even household pets. Banquet halls